For South Africa, it is pretty beneficial. For instance, BMW cars go into the US duty-free under the scheme, and some agricultural goods as well. But one has to remember that by and large, the US does not charge high tariffs on imports generally. It's actually a duty-free zone with some significant exceptions in agriculture and clothing and textiles, for instance. So AGOA is useful. It provides extra concessions at the margin, and therefore the government is looking to get our access extended by 15 years.
The US, though, is asking for concessions, I understand, for this to continue. According to our report on the ground, they're raising things like our protection of poultry, beef and pork, for instance. Will we have to bend here, change policy substantially for what you're saying is not a huge boost for our exporters?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, so to speak. So there are quite a few lobbies in the United States that are pushing for South Africa to be graduated, that's the trade wonk terminology, from the AGOA scheme and from the US GSP scheme of which AGOA is a part. And the reason they're doing that is because they argue that the US extends unilaterally duty-free access to its market, but in return, South Africa is putting up the barriers to US exports, which in some products it is. And not only that, but that we're also making it more difficult for their companies to invest in the South African market. For instance, through pieces of legislation such as the Private Security Amendment Act, the Land Reform Bills, the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act, and of course the Promotion and Protection of Investment Bill, all of which will make it more difficult for foreigners to operate in this market.
Peter, do you think we will have to bend here? For me, it seems like a choice for South Africa now. How independent are we going to be, and at what cost?
It's a very interesting question. I would love to get inside our Department of Trade and Industry and Trade Minister's mind on this question, because they're pursuing an industrial strategy that is much more inward-looking than in the past, seeking to promote domestic industrial development through protectionist measures, amongst other instruments. And that's not compatible with opening up on a broad front to US imports. But on the other hand, the US is threatening to withdraw the scheme. So it's a very difficult balancing act that Rob Davies particularly has to pursue. And I'm not convinced that he's prepared to give the US what it wants, in which case we may well be heading into a graduation scenario with some quite serious impacts for particular businesses.
In your opinion, is what the US asking for fair? Because this seems to go a bit far for me. The US Chamber of Commerce is saying they'd like to talk about repealing anti-dumping laws. Now, I would think that we have to have that right to protect ourselves from the damages of dumping.
Well, just on that issue, that's a bit like the pot calling the kettle black. The US has its own anti-dumping laws and makes extensive use of the instrument. It doesn't particularly target South African exports, but it certainly targets a range of other countries' exports. So I don't see that being a viable option to pursue. But you know, the US has a point. Whether it's fair or not, that's a value judgment that's difficult to make. The real question is whether you believe in a freer trading environment or not. By and large, I do, and so I think it would actually be beneficial to open the market more. Those who don't will clearly see it as an unfair proposition.
Final question. If we don't, of course we're increasing trade with the BRIC countries. We're looking much more at South-South trade. But if we lose this connection with the US, are we in danger of becoming but more isolated, especially because the US and Europe are looking at this North-North free trade agreement?
Yeah, that's a huge subject we should discuss another day. But essentially, yes, we would become relatively more isolated. Look, trade with the US would not stop. Certain product lines would be negatively affected for sure. But as I said, the US is by and large a duty-free market. So trade would continue pretty much as normal, with a few significant exceptions, potentially BMW cars, for instance.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah. I'm going to stop it there. Thank you very much. Peter Draper from Tutwa Consulting. He was joining us from our studio in Pretoria.